Hey there, in the spirit of updates on things that have happened since your textbook was published, of which there seem to be an awful lot in the Russia case study, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what Russia has been doing in Ukraine for the last 6-7 years, and give you a couple of things to consider about Russian foreign policy. So, a little geography lesson to start us off. Ukraine is a country on the sort of southwestern border of Russia, former Soviet republic, independent since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Crimea is this little peninsula sticking out into the Black Sea, was considered part of Ukraine's sovereign territory until somewhat recently, and I'll cover those developments in a second. So the first question we have to deal with is, why is it that Russia cares so much about Ukraine in general and about Crimea in particular? I'll show you a couple of maps that I hope will illuminate the question. This one shows you the percentage of the population in Ukraine as of 2001 that said that Russian rather than Ukrainian was their native language. And you can see particular concentrations of Russian as a first language speakers in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. Here is similar, there's kind of some overlapping data about ethno-linguistic groups in Ukraine. It's always kind of dicey in any circumstance to try and really nail down a person's ethnicity. But the information that we have is that there are a bunch of people, particularly in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, who consider themselves ethnically Russian. And there are a bunch of people who are kind of ethnically Ukrainian, but predominantly Russian speaking in eastern Ukraine as well. The next two maps are going to show you the results of two recent presidential elections in Ukraine. So you can see a significant geographic cleavage in voting behavior here. Here you see in the 2004 presidential election, majorities of the East, and particularly strong majorities in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, voting for a candidate named Viktor Yanukovych, who was running on a more pro-Russian platform. By contrast, in the West, more people are voting for a candidate named Viktor Yushchenko, who's running on a more pro-European platform and incidentally gets poisoned during the course of this campaign. Yanukovych wins, fast forward to 2010 when he's running for re-election against a candidate named Yulia Tymoshenko, who has by far the best hair in all of European politics, bar none, no question. It's not a debate. And once again, we see Yanukovych's support being much stronger in the east of the country, given that Yanukovych is running on this platform of relatively closer relations to Russia, relatively less interest in stronger trade and political relationships with the European Union. This suggests that there's some kind of ideological cleavage in which the east of Ukraine thinks we'd like to be closer to Russia, and the west of Ukraine thinks we'd like to be closer to Europe. So, to sum up, why does Russia care so much about Ukraine and about Crimea? Number one, there's a significant Russian minority, whether you define that in ethnic or linguistic terms, in Ukraine, particularly in the east and particularly in Crimea. Number two, as we said, there are social/political cleavages in Ukraine itself, and that might present Russia with an opportunity to try and peel off some chunks of eastern Ukraine by exploiting those domestic social and political cleavages. Third, of course, is history. Really hard to escape, especially when we're talking about Russia, but probably when we're talking about anything. Ukraine has been under Russian sovereignty for much of the last 400 years. As the Russian Empire expands, one place it expands is into what it calls the Ukraine, which is a contentious way to refer to Ukraine, especially from the perspective of people who really support stronger sovereignty for Ukraine. But Ukraine plays a major role in supplying strategic resources such as coal and iron, and particularly in supplying food to the Russian Empire. Under the Empress Catherine the Great, or I should say the Tsarina Catherine the Great, in the 18th century, the Russian government pursues a policy known as Russification, in which they attempt to promote Orthodox Christianity of the Russian variety. They attempt to spread the Russian language. In some cases, they'll resettle ethnically Russian people into minority-dominated areas. And so some of the Russian population and the Russian cultural heritage in Ukraine and in Crimea date back to that political effort. When the Soviet Union is formed, Ukraine is one of its constituent republics and remains so until 1991. And it's worth noting that Crimea, as such, was merged into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, but that didn't give Ukraine a huge amount of control over Crimea itself, given just the power of Russian administration in the Soviet system. And so I think it's worth noting that when Crimea was assigned to Ukrainian sovereignty, many Russians, particularly the Russian political elite, didn't necessarily think that that meant handing over Crimea to Ukraine forever and ever. Last thing to point out is that Russia, while it has a really long coastline, has a mostly frozen coastline. One of the long-standing strategic problems for Russian czars and Communist Party leaders alike has been trying to get an all-season warm water port where you can project naval power even without breaking up the ice before sending your boats out into the sea. And Crimea has historically served as a really important port for the Russian Navy to launch operations into the Black Sea and thence into the Mediterranean. So as long as Russia's interested in projecting power, particularly in the Middle East and in Southern Europe more generally, Crimea is going to be super important to them in terms of being able, just having a place where their Navy can operate year-round in all weather. So fast forward to 2013, and let's try and catch up on how Russia gets most directly involved in Ukraine, because those issues continue to reverberate today. So the backstory is that in the early 2010s, one of the major issues confronting Viktor Yanukovych when he's president of Ukraine is that Ukraine is kind of torn between its relationship with Russia and its relationship with the European Union. And in 2013, Yanukovych has this offer on the table, which would allow Ukraine's economy and political system to be more integrated with the European Union. Potentially down the road, that would be a significant step towards EU membership for Ukraine. And in November of 2013, Yanukovych rejects this. And a general interpretation that's popular at the time is that he's doing this because he would prefer to choose a closer relationship with Russia. Protests erupt throughout Ukraine, but particularly in Kiev, the capital. And so Yanukovych starts to feel as if his political futures are threatened. In February of 2014, the protest reached such a head that Yanukovych flees to Russia, which is not going to do a whole lot for the popular perception of Yanukovych as an independent Ukrainian patriot. A sense kind of emerges that Russia has really been Yanukovych's political patron all along. In March of 2014, Russia sends troops into Crimea, ostensibly in order to quell the disorder there, in order to reestablish some kind of order, and very quickly holds a referendum in which people in Crimea vote by overwhelming margins to join Russia. You can probably figure out why I've put a sarcastic asterisk next to vote there, but the short version is that it's difficult to say whether there would be a truly free and fair election if the question is, do you want to merge, to submit yourself to the sovereignty of the country whose tanks are currently in a lot of your public places? I don't mean to say that there was a totally fraudulent result. I think, the evidence that we looked at a minute ago should suggest to you that there actually is some amount of pro-Russian sentiment in Crimea that is genuine, that is not just a result of Russian coercion or of Russian co-optation. But the general consensus in the international community was that can't possibly be a free and fair election, and I'm inclined to agree with that. The next month, rebel groups in eastern Ukraine start taking that possibility of Russia annexing Ukrainian territory outside of Crimea. They start seizing territory and fighting against government troops in eastern Ukraine along that Russian border. And that summer, Russia's army enters Ukraine formally to support the rebels. There's a great deal of uncertainty and confusion and propaganda and spin about the exact degree to which Russia was involved in especially those Eastern Ukrainian separatist / pro-Russian movements. And it's not 100% clear what's happened or when the timeline of Russia's involvement. But there's some pieces of evidence that point to the idea that Russia is certainly friendly to these separatists and probably actively and materially supporting them. One sort of term that becomes really popular in the reporting around these Eastern Ukrainian wars is the term little green men, in kind of an allusion to those little green plastic toy soldiers that kids, I guess, in the 50s had. These are people who are fighting against the Ukrainian government, fighting for political autonomy or independence in Eastern Ukraine, who claim to be Ukrainian nationalists. They claim to be independent, and they don't have any insignias on their uniforms. But they happen to have a lot of the same equipment as soldiers in the Russian army do. And so analysts who are smarter than me conclude this probably means they're receiving Russian support. Hilariously, somebody asked Russia's defense minister about rumors that the Russians were supporting or sending their special forces in to support these Ukrainian separatists. And what he says is the following. Regarding the statements about use of Russian special forces in Ukrainian events, I can say only one thing. It's hard to search for a black cat in a dark room, especially if it's not there. But then he adds that searching for a black cat in a dark room would be stupid if the cat is intelligent, brave, and polite. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what he's trying to say there. Russia issues a great deal of propaganda. You already know that there's significant overlap between the state, Putin's buddies, and owners of major Russian media outlets. And so Russia issues a lot of propaganda that describes that anti-Yanukovych pro-European movement in Kiev and in Western Ukraine as a conspiracy backed by America, that describes the pro-Westerners in Ukraine as being fascists. And Russia consistently says that it has nothing to do whatsoever with these separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. But again, the evidence kind of points in a different direction. So, what does the international community do about this? Because Russia basically just barging into Crimea and grabbing land, annexing Crimea, and they very rapidly make it integrate it as a subnational unit of government in Russia. They give Sevastopol, the city in Crimea, the status of the third federal city in Russia after Moscow and St. Petersburg. So this is a significant challenge to the norms of international law, which say that you can't just go ahead and start a war because you want somebody else's stuff. And so that raises the question of what the rest of the world is going to do about this. The actors that have been most directly involved in responding to Russian intervention in Ukraine are the United States and the European Union, and they have done a couple of things. They've imposed economic sanctions, particularly on members of Putin's government, on people who are closely associated with Putin, even if they don't have formal roles in the state. And so now it's more difficult for those people to travel to the United States or to have bank accounts in the European Union, for instance. And there's broader economic sanctions that attempt to reduce Russia's ability to finance these kinds of military operations by selling oil and gas, particularly. There's been some diplomatic isolation of Russia, some sternly worded letters condemning Russia. Russia was uninvited to the G8 summit, which is a group of 8 wealthy nations that get together annually and set policy. So now it's supposed to be the G7 summit. And the US and the European Union have increased aid and, in some instances, arms sales to Ukraine. And by the way, if you followed the impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump in this winter of 2020, time passes, I forget, you might note that there was a lot of back and forth about whether Trump or Obama or somebody else altogether had held up arms sales to Ukraine or been sufficiently supportive of Ukraine. That's the context in which it matters that the United States is selling, say, anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainian government. That said, one other thing worth noting is that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is this organization founded in the Cold War right after World War II to try and coordinate Western military responses to what was then Soviet aggression. NATO has increased its presence and its operation on Russia's western border. They keep doing these war games and these exercises just in case some power from the East decides to invade some Eastern European country, and that's pretty clear that that's preparation for the possibility of a war with Russia. That said, 6-7 years later, Russia continues to occupy Crimea. Russia has de facto established sovereignty in Crimea, even though the international community hasn't necessarily recognized Russia's right to do that outside of a couple countries. And the US and the European Union have not significantly escalated and certainly have not made any noises about using military force directly to try and get Russia out of Crimea. So you can kind of judge for yourself exactly how much that matters from the US and the European perspective. I want to turn finally to the domestic political consequences, because one might think that waging what the international community considers a war of aggression against a relatively weaker nation, essentially for pride and or securing a warm water naval port. One might think that that would tank a president's popularity, but in fact, exactly the opposite has happened to Vladimir Putin's approval ratings. You can see, these are pretty good polling data, actually. It's difficult to get good public opinion data out of Russia, but the Levada Center tends to do really good and pretty reliable surveys. What you can see from this information is that Vladimir Putin's approval rating went way, way up after the annexation of Crimea, and that rise in his approval rating was mostly sustainable until 2018, when his proposed pension reforms really directly threatened the livelihoods of a lot of older Russians. So domestically, it kind of appears that this has been a good thing for Vladimir Putin. A couple questions to think about that I'll leave you with. Number one, why would we see that spike? Why would we see the Russian citizenry respond so positively to what appears, from at least an American perspective, to be just a naked act of aggression? Second, why might this be a problem for Putin, even if his approval ratings go up? Is there a way in which this kind of aggressive foreign policy action in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world might ultimately have a negative consequence for Vladimir Putin's political power? And then finally, if you're interested in thinking about the foreign relations, the international relations aspect of this class, which we don't spend a ton of time talking about, given your knowledge of Russia's domestic politics and of Russia's economic situation, you might start to think about what the rest of the world could do about Russian intervention in Ukraine, since it doesn't seem that anything that's been done so far is succeeding in getting Russia to reduce its intervention. I'll leave it there. I'll talk to you soon about Russian foreign policy. Thank you.